the opposite side from the outward seam, we have the inward seam. So this curved seam goes the opposite direction. So you might see this one on a neckline of a dress or a shirt, or you might see it something in more home decoration. But when you peel this one open or flip it inside out, what you'll see is that the seam allowance mostly stays intact, but rather than notches in which we take out fabric, we will do clips. So we're just clipping into the seam to relieve that tension. Because when this seam flips inside out to go right way out, we need to make sure that the seam allowance will actually spread to accommodate that curve. So I'll show you as we're building it, but what you'll see is that if we don't clip this seam, then when we go to flip it, it won't actually move. So please write this down. Clipping eases tension. Unlike the outwards curve, where notching reduces bulk. So on the outward seam, we notch to reduce bulk or excess seam allowance. And on the inwards curve, we clip to relieve tension to allow it to actually spread and make a curve. So with our handy pattern plate, I'm going to go into the body of the fabric. I'm just drawing on the one side. But when I do that, I want you guys to visualize this shape that I'm making. So we don't want to put our plate too far over to the side, because this is going to become the garment, and this on this side is going to become all negative space that we're going to cut away. This is the opposite of the other curve. So thinking about bringing your plate in to create a curve, but still giving yourself some room on this side to work, much like the sample piece. And then if you need a reminder while you're working that this is this part that we're keeping, you can always give yourself a little X on the side that will become seam allowance. So before we pin anything together, we're going to mark our seam allowance on the inside edge, so then that way we can cut away our excess once we're ready. So just like the outwards curve, but on the opposite side of that same line, I'll do that same technique where I'll line up 5/8 away from that stitch line. So I've counted 5 boxes away from it, or towards yourself. So now I can pin my layers together just like we did with the plain seam. So making sure that I have my right sides touching, so I'm going to fold them so that my right sides of my fabric are placed together. I'll be keeping this part of my sample, so I'll make sure that those edges are looking nice, because no one will ever know if this side doesn't line up as well. And just like the outwards curve, I'm going to pin my stitch line by pinning my ends first, perpendicular to my intended stitch line. And the reason why we pin our ends and then our centers is that we know these fabric pieces are about the same size. If I were to start pushing and smooshing, I could potentially push my fabric out of alignment. So now that I've alternated between pinning perpendicularly and parallel on that stitch line, I'm ready to go sew at the machine. And like a lot of our plain stitches, our stay stitches, we'll make sure that we're on a 0 zig and on a 3 stay stitch. So now that we're ready to start stitching, I'm going to place my seam into the machine. And so you guys can actually see I've made a bit of an error, right? Is that I pinned in a way that put my seam allowance on the left and not on the right. But luckily we're working on a small enough piece that it'll be okay. So I've lined up my curved stitch line with that notch on my presser foot. I'm going to start stitching by holding my threads and by back stitching. And as I go, I will keep my perpendicular pins in, and I will remove these parallel pins as I get close. So now that you're stitched, you're just going to trim your thread tails to make it a little bit neater before moving on to cutting your fabric. So now in order to access our actual seam, we're just going to cut on our cutting line so that we can have our 5/8 seam allowance and then the body of our little baby garment here. So you can see with both the inseam and the outward seam that we're asking you to utilize the skills you learned in Chapter 3 on those circular road tests. But I wanted to show you guys what would happen if I tried to flip this, much like I had shown you with our sample. So our finished sample right here, we have all those clips to allow the seam line to move. But if I were to flip this right side out, it actually makes the nice shape. It makes that inwards curve. Now watch this sadness. So I'm trying to stretch this open. But you see how it's rumpled and I can't get these edges to lay flat? If you look at the seam allowance, you see how it's curling and buckling and getting in our way? It's because this line, this circumference, is smaller than this circumference. So to use our plate as an example, we've used our plate, and if we were to, again, just like the outward seam, if we were to draw a circle to complete that line, can you see how the seam allowance line makes a smaller circle? So when your seam allowance has a smaller circumference than the actual garment, then we have to clip in order to make this expand to a larger line. So before I clip, I'm actually going to move and grade down my seam allowance. So I'm going to cut that down by half. So then that way, if this was really bulky fabric, it wouldn't make such a poofy, curved, waffly seam. So if it's easier, you can kind of pull the fabric upright. It's just not really good for your wrist to try to cut sideways. So you can cut on an angle, or you can make sure that as you're working, you're not cutting through both layers. So now I'm ready to actually start clipping my seam. So at about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch increments, I'm going to clip through both layers and try to end about 1/8 of an inch or closer to my stitch line. It's really important that you don't try to cut with the body of the scissors, because if you go too far, you'll sever your stitch line. And now that I have that clipped, do you see how that seam will move and pivot? But before we worry about that, we'll go ahead and press it. So like you remember from all the other seams, a seam is not done until it is pressed. But you might be like, Jen, this is crazy, it's a curved seam, how do I press it? You're actually going to fold this backwards so that one side flips open and one side stays flat. So we're not worrying about a ham, we're just trying to press this seam open, and that's part of what the clips allow us to do. So making sure that your ends are nice and open right here, and then keeping your fingers out of the way of the iron, but you're basically going to just peel those little clipped pieces back. So you can see how right now you have your shorter end flipped down and your longer side laying flat. We're actually going to press this seam twice. So right now we have that pressed open to make it nice and crisp, and then we're going to flip it to the right side, and this is going to be weird, but how you can find it is that you put your fingers on the seam and then you flip it so that your fabric then goes wrong sides together, and you see how that curve just erupts? Just be mindful, you might have these ends trying to escape inwards, so just pinch them outwards. And you're placing it, you're rolling your fabric and kind of smooshing it until your seam line is right on edge. So can you see how that seam is right here on edge? It's not rolling to one side. So I'm going to finger press, just kind of get that prepped, and work your way down the line. And once you have all that kind of laid out in place, then you can go ahead and press it one more time. And how you know you got it right is that when you look to the inside, your seam allowance should be nice and splayed open, but laying flat. And the ends of your seam have the seam line open and visible. They're not hiding inside a folded edge. Now an outwards curve, this one's a little bit exaggerated, but it's a curved seam that you'll often see either as a scallop on the bottom of something, the curve of a lapel or a jacket. But the important thing is that it's the same steps as a plain seam, but when it's done on a curve, we have a few things we have to do on the inside. So you'll see how the seam allowance actually has been cut. So those are the notches. Notches are when you take large triangle cuts out of the seam allowance to allow it to have room to fold to the inside. Because if I were to fold that without cutting anything, the seam allowance, there would be too much of it to fit inside the curve of that seam and it would ruffle. So by doing these notches, that makes it easier for that seam to lay nice and flat. The first thing to do is to mark your seam allowance. So I'm going to have two of these pieces of fabric, but I'll only mark the seam allowance on one side. So in order to make sure that I create something like the sample, where I'll be drawing a curved seam into one part of the fabric, I'm going to take our handy pattern piece, which happens to double as a plate, and I'm just going to fit it so then that way I'm taking up most of the circle. So this part here is going to become the part that we use for our sample. So just tilting it so you can see, I'm going to treat this like my ruler, or my pattern piece rather, and I'm just going to draw my stitch line. So like you can see here, I've drawn my stitch line on my fabric, just like I will sew on this sample piece right here. So we have our sewn or to be sewn stitch line. We need to add our 5/8 seam allowance. So just like you guys did on your bodice piece, you're going to line up 5/8 on your ruler with your existing stitch line. And you're just going to give yourself a series of notches 5/8 away from the edge so that you can mark your seam allowance. So just like my plain seam, I'm going to layer my right sides together, lining up my edges. And if your pieces aren't the exact same, that's okay. All this is going away later, so I'm making sure that these sides are even. And then just like my plain seam, I'm going to pin perpendicularly to my line all the way around. And now what's important is don't look at the edge of the fabric and line your pins up that way. Make your pins run perpendicularly to your intended stitch line. So that way when you take your presser foot and you go to sew, it'll sew straight over top. It won't get bumped by these being in the way. So just like your plain seam, you're going to pin your ends first. And then you can pin your center, making sure that your fabric is nice and flat. And like much of the seams today, we'll make sure that we're on a 0 zig and on a 3 stay stitch. So now that I'm ready to sew, I'll place my fabric so that I can line up my stitch line with the notch on my presser foot. I'm holding my threads to start, and I'll backstitch to start end to end my seam. And I'll be able to leave these pins in that are perpendicular to my stitch line, and I'll remove the ones that are on the line as I go. So now that you've sewn, you're just going to trim your thread tails. So now we're ready actually to reveal the shape of this piece that we're working on. And we're just going to cut on the cutting line. Now we could have done this earlier, but it's actually just easier to sew with things like this. This is more of a thing we do for this sample. If it was a real garment, then yes, you would have already had a curved edge that you would have been pinning together. But we get to cheat a little bit when we're learning the techniques, yeah? So for the sake of both of these samples, the inwards and the outwards curve, we're going to grade the seam, which means we're going to cut this seam down by 1/2 and leave the other one fully intact. Now, if I were just to flip this so that the right sides were together, you'll see that the seam allowance is actually going to throw me a bunch of attitude. Do you remember in the earlier sample how it had those notches? I'm going to show you what happens if we don't do that. So even though I've flipped this pattern, and right now it's creating the desired outward seam, right? We can see how the seam is convex. Can you see how this is a little bit strained? It's hard for me to roll that edge. But if we look on the inside, can you see all that waffling, all that ruffling of fabric? That's because there's too much seam allowance to fit inside the seam in the place that's been given. So turning that wrong side out again. A good rule of thumb, we had talked before in the inward seam, that we need to notch to reduce bulk, and we clip to release pressure. So if we have our stitch line right here, if we were to complete this full circle, so giving you the visual of our plate, we have our circle that is our stitch line. This line out here is a bigger circumference. If we were to continue that line, do you see how that would be a bigger circumference? When our outer circumference is bigger than our inner circumference, that means the seam is going to need to be reduced, and we do notches to allow for that. So now using our scissors, we're going to notch around the circumference of our circle. We're going to notch equidistantly apart, probably about every 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch, and we're going to go as close as we can to the stitch line without actually cutting it or crossing it. So just using the tips of your scissors. You never want to cut like this, because what happens if you go a little bit too far, right? You could actually cut your seam. So just using the tip bit here and keeping the points of your triangles about 3/4 or a 1/2 inch apart, and making sure you're cutting through both the thinned graded layer and the full layer. You're just going to evenly notch all the way around your seam. So the goal with notches is making sure that you are evenly spaced, not just between your notches, but also in depth. You're trying to hit about 1/8 of an inch away from your stitch line, so then that way it's close enough to make a difference, but not so close that it compromises your stitch line. Then that way, when we flip this right side out and we look inside, can you see how the seam is laying a little bit flatter? Before we can do this fully, we're going to iron it. And so just like our inward seam, we're now going to press this stitch line open. So being careful, and you're just going to fold back the short side, and you just nose the iron through. I'm not using a ton of steam, or barely any, especially when my hand is nearby. But you see how I can start the iron? See how I can start the iron and then kind of fold the fabric into it, and then I can pull the next one into place and get my hand out of the way? Once I have that open, this pressing just makes it easier for my seam to be nice on edge. Now I'll flip it right side and shove all those layers in, and then I'm going to clean up that seam. You see how it's looks like a frog's mouth? It's kind of being pulled in. Just run your finger on the inside or roll your fabric like this. Use the friction of your fingers to kind of work that fabric outwards. And you're aiming to get that stitch line to be nice and right on edge. But see how it's a little bit spongy? We'll give it one last press.